Come on, Dwayne, the big sound. Yeah, yeah. Hello, New Jersey. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a drummer extraordinaire. The name speaks for itself. Thelonious Monk Jr. Welcome him, please.
Aha, good afternoon. They invited me here today, and I kind of said, I'm no educator. And they said, but that's okay, come, because you're doing good things. And I said, yeah, but I don't know that much about the drums. And they said, yeah, but come, because you're doing good things. So I came, and I can tell you quite frankly, I've been mortified in my hotel room all day long, thinking about what I was going to say to you guys and gals when I got over here today, because my mind was a blank. I don't ordinarily do educational seminars per se, so I don't have any set thing. But then I thought about it a little bit, and I said, well, why are they asking me to come there? They asked me to come there because I'm running around the world with a band that's swinging like hell, and people are hearing about it, so they figure I can swing, and that's certainly an ingredient that we need with drummers, whether you're playing straight ahead stuff like me, or funk, or rock, or no matter what it is. So then I said, well, maybe in some way I can impart some of the concepts that I know about on the drums and play a little bit for you, and talk a bit about growing up around my dad and the whole scene, and how that kind of affected me, and why I do what I do today. For those of you who don't know, and there was a time, I swear to God, there was a time when I was the youngest. I mean, I would be in a room full of people like this, and I was the youngest. And it just turned around on me, and now I'm always the oldest. It's gonna happen to every single one of you too. but what I have found, when I was younger, I'm 43 years old, and when I was younger, like in my 20s and 30s, despite being Thelonious Monk Jr., I really spent my time playing R&B music, and when many of you, as I can see by the peach fuzz all over these faces, when many of you were in elementary school at best, if not just running around your mom's dresses, I was actually running around America singing and playing drums at the same time as an R&B guy named T.S. Monk, making funk records. So at 43, and I started doing that when I was, say, 25, and I didn't start playing drums until I was 15, my experience as a jazz player, right, really, I have about 7 years experience in all of my 43 years as a jazz player, but I've managed to find a way to play on somewhat of a world-class level, and I think a lot of that has to do with the things that I learned from the guys that were around me when I was young. So let me begin at the beginning, tell you a little bit about myself. My dad is Thelonious Monk. He is one of the, what I call Mighty Three. Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie are generally credited with inventing bebop and pioneering modern jazz. It's really not true, and any one of them would have told you that it's not true. It involves an awful lot of people, but their names come up all the time, right? Contrary to popular belief, most people would think that since my dad was Thelonious Monk, and since I grew up in a house, and I must tell you that John Coltrane, Art Blakey, Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Horace Silver, Sonny Rollins, Max Roach, all of these people were in the house constantly from the day I was born. It's like the second face I knew in life was Art Blakey, right? So these people were around all the time, and I must tell you in all honesty that I only knew them as Art, Max, Bud, Miles, Bird, Diz, right? And I didn't even really know their last names till I was 8 or 9 years old. That's how close they were. That's how much they were apart of my existence. But contrary to popular belief, these cats didn't talk a lot about music when they were running around the house. I mean, they played a lot of music, but they talked more about, I guess, what you could only call the philosophy behind the music, the democracy involved in the music, and the individuality that was involved in the music. And that's, excuse me, mostly what I got. And those are the things that sort of formed the way I approached my instrument, because it seemed that they were saying most of the time that technical proficiency was something that most of us can acquire to a certain degree. We can all find a way to learn to play very fast, and we can all find a way to learn to play a lot of notes. But the spirit behind the music is what differentiates the cats that we quote unquote say can play and the rest of us. So in the spirit of the philosophy, I realize now at this late date that my father was very, very wise. And the first thing he did with me musically was zero. He had no musical involvement with me at all from the day I was born until the day I said to him, "Daddy, I want to play the drums." In other words, there was no encouragement to jump on the piano. There was no prerequisite to play any instrument at all or be involved in music in any way. And I think that that's very important, because had he not done that, I don't think that I would necessarily be sitting here today in front of you, a confident musician who feels like, you know, I'm doing my own thing. I ain't Dizzy Gillespie and Monk, but I got my own little bag of tricks, and I feel good about myself. So music was something that I floated into absolutely on my own, and I think that was the key. He wanted it to be something that I absolutely adored on my own, and he took me aside when I was a very young cat, and he said, "Look, I'm Thelonious Monk Sr., you're Thelonious Monk Jr. We're two different people. There are going to be a lot of people that are going to tell you that you need to do this, that, and the other cause of who you are. And there are going to be a lot of people who, to paraphrase it, will try to relive my career vicariously through you and don't allow them to do that, you see." And that freed me from his shadow, so to speak. In other words, I didn't have the weight of feeling obligated to follow the footsteps of my father, because my father had excelled in a particular area. And that's real important, particularly for anyone who does well in any endeavor. And then you have a kid, and if you do so well that the public makes note of it, then you should always be very, very careful to protect your kid. And my father did that. So that began a fun story, because then I wasn't obligated to play any instrument. And actually, in the beginning, I thought the trumpet was really, really cool. I thought Miles was just too cool, man. He had the trumpet up in the air, and he was laid back, and he was, you know, the music was slick. So I jumped on the trumpet initially. That was my first instrument, and it was very, very cool, but it hurt my face something fierce. I could not handle that whole operation up here in front of my head. Just turned me off. So I said later for the trumpet. I did that for about a year and a half or 2 years. All the time, all the while, my father not paying any attention other than to find me a musician, a good musician that might give me some lessons. And he really was a boyfriend to one of my cousins, so I don't think he really even looked too hard for a teacher, because he wanted to see if I was for real. It was something I wanted to do, and apparently he was absolutely right, because it wasn't something that I wanted to do. But I went away to private school by the time I was 12, and my first day, music lessons were part of the curriculum, right? And so I had to take music lessons. So I figured, well, what the hell, I'll take piano lessons. It seems like the right thing to do. And I remember walking up this long staircase in the top of this dormitory to meet this short little old woman. Her name was Mrs. Pratt, right? Mrs. Pratt sits me down, and the first thing out of her mouth was, "Now, Thelonious, I want to tell you, first of all, that your father plays the piano wrong." Right? And I said, I was a wise ass back then. And I said, "Mrs. Pratt, but aren't we sitting up here in the top of this old dormitory and my dad is touring the world? I don't get it." Well, needless to say, that started a very tumultuous relationship, which lasted, as a matter of fact, for 5 years. But she did another good thing. She totally turned me off to the piano, so I got that out of my system. Not only did I have sense enough not to touch it, but she made me hate it, right? And but when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I suspect, I was at a recording session with my father, one of his most famous recording sessions. It was a session called Brilliant Corners. And at that session, right, Max Roach was the drummer. And Max, on that session, I mean, I thought it was spectacular because he was not only was he playing the drums, but he was playing the timpanis too. And he was doing a little bit of it at the same time. And I had never really seen anything like that, though at 8 or 9 years old, I hadn't seen a whole hell of a lot. But certainly this was new to my musical vocabulary. And at the end of that session, he gave me a set of drumsticks, right? Now, I had kind of understood the drums from day one because, like I said, the second face I ever saw in life was Art Blakey. And my father let me hang out a lot. He took me around from the time I was a real little guy. So I understood the way the kit went together. Like, I just saw it, and I could kind of see what Art was doing when he was playing. I mean, I didn't know what I was seeing, but I kind of understood it. So the whole time I was messing with the trumpet and I was messing with the piano, I had already had this predisposition to the drums. And then Max had given me the sticks. And when I got in private school and I was taking these hostile piano lessons under siege, there was a young cat, and I'll never forget him. His name is unimportant, but this kid was, he was about, let's say I was about 13, no, I was about 14, and he was about 13, and he had one of these endless drum sets. I mean, he had like double bass drum, he had tom-toms going off onto the horizon, really, and this was in like 1963. Right, when nobody was playing a setup like this, but he had kind of a Jones for the big band cats, the Rufus Haynes and the Louis Bellsons and those cats, and he had just overdone it. And he gave me a set of his sticks, which I remember right now they looked like tree trunks to me. But he gave me this set of sticks, and so I started playing on a pillow at school, right? And I played on the pillows at school for 2 years, right? And nobody in my family knew that I liked drums, and my dad didn't. Nobody knew anything about it at all. And I just practiced on this pillow, and I practiced not to Monk, really, and not to Bird, really, but I really practiced to all the Motown records that were, because this was the music of my time, and there was no prerequisite in the house to listen to Dad or listen to his friends. So I was practicing to the Temptations and to, all the silly stuff that was on in the early 60s. So you all are listening to some, in many ways people say, oh, the old stuff was better, the old stuff was better. Don't believe that completely. I'm telling you, there was a lot of garbage back then. But I was practicing to that stuff, and I came home when I was 15, and I said, and I was practicing in my room, not realizing, see, I have a son and a daughter now, and once you're a parent, you know everything your kid's doing. At least for the first 5 or 10 years of their life, you just know every move they make. They can't do anything in the house and you don't know about it. But I was practicing on my pillow in the room, and I figured nobody knew because my room was closed, but my dad knew what I was doing, and he kind of took note of it. And I went to him and I said, Dad, I want a drum set. And he kind of looked at me, and as a matter of fact, I didn't even go to him first. I went to my mother first, and I said, Mom, I want a drum set. And I said, I think I can rent one down at a little music store down Broadway. And she gave me about $50, and I went down and rented this little drum set by a company called Broadway. Whew, what a joke. When I think about that drum set, it was unbelievable. But anyway, I'm banging these drums in the house. Now I've got them out in the living room, and so I'm exposed now. I've exposed myself to my dad. But he still didn't say anything. He didn't say a word. He was just watching me. And finally I got up the nerve and I said, Dad, I think I want to play drums. And at that point, he basically said 2 things to me. He said, learn how to read, and you need a teacher. And then he picked up the phone. Over the next couple of days, he called Art Blakey, and that's where I got my first drum set, was from Art Blakey. Then he picked up the phone again, and it's funny. I got to tell you this story. My father he was really a funny cat, right? There was a great, great drummer by the name of Willie Jones. He was the drummer for the early Mingus bands, and he was the drummer for the great Lester Young. And at the time I started playing, Willie Jones was hanging with my dad a lot, right? So now, my father wanted Max Roach to give me my first lessons, right? But he was hanging with Willie all the time, every day, and he didn't want to hurt Willie's feelings, right? So, and Willie Jones told me this story. He says, you know, your father came to me and he said, Willie, the kid wants to play the drums. What do you think of that? So Willie said, oh man, that's hip, that's dynamite. So he said, Willie, look, if he's gonna play the drums, I gotta get him a teacher, right? So Willie said, yeah, man, shit, yeah, you know you gotta get him a teacher. He said, and I should get him, if I can get him a teacher, I should get him the greatest drummer in the world, right? Now here, Willie's fainted in the corner already. Yeah, well, yeah, Monk, yeah, you better get him the greatest player in the world. So he said, well, then you won't feel bad because I'm gonna call Max to give him a lesson. Right? And, but anyway, he got his point across to Willie, and Willie accepted it, and Thelonious sent me off to Max to get my first lessons. Now, studying with Max was not about going in the door and with a book and saying, okay, Max Roach, I'm here for my lesson. It wasn't about that. And this gets into the philosophy behind what we play and why we play it. Studying with Max Roach was really the opportunity to hang, the opportunity to sit right behind him, be the young guy who got to sit right behind him when he played his gigs in New York. The opportunity to go up to his crib and just sit around and hang out with different cats coming in and out, and he'd sit down and show me a concept and talk to me about what I practice and why I practice it. But it was the hang. It was the spirit, and I have to emphasize that because people say, well, when you study with Max, and Tony Williams studied with Max, and a lot of good young drummers studied with Max, but everybody who has done that basically got the hangout card for a certain amount of time, and I can't emphasize how important that is because that's what formulated, you know, why I approach the drums the way I do. I'm gonna play a little bit for you. Not a whole lot because I'm working like a dog down at the Catalina Bar and Grill. And the band is monstrous. If you want to hear a smoking band, I know you cats get a student discount, I would advise you to check out the T.S. Monk band at the Catalina Bar and Grill. This is not a ego thing. This is some stone cold hard facts. The band is smoking. But at any rate, I'm going to play a little bit, and I'm going to just show you a little bit the things that Max first showed me in the beginning and kind of where they led me, you know. He talked a lot about storytelling, and if you understand Max Roach, you'll understand that he clearly has been the guy that brought melody to the drums. He's sort of the guy, and this is not to say that any one guy, because as we know as musicians, there's no one guy that makes anything happen alone. It doesn't happen alone. It's generally a collective effort, maybe concentrated more around one person. But a lot of people contribute. But for me, when I look over the history of the drums, I have to say that Max Roach is the guy that turned us into musicians in the perception of the rest of the public. Because up until Max Roach, you had musicians and you had drummers. And Max was the cat who came along and sat down at the drums like the chairman of the board of, you know, RJR Reynolds Corporation, and played musical things and played melodies and things that everybody can understand, and became very, very mainstream in terms of what a drum solo can be for the jazz listener's ear. Now, the first thing that Max showed me, I remember coming into his house one day, and there were two other young guys there in the house, and they scared me to death. They scared me absolutely to death. The first problem was I was confused. I was one of those cats that I was left-handed, right? But every drummer I saw was playing right-handed, right? But that was very uncomfortable for me, so I had my drums set up like a right-handed drummer, with my bass drum here and my sock cymbal here, but I was playing like a left-handed drummer because I was riding with this hand and playing the cross stick with this hand. And Max, the first thing he did when I sat down and saw that, he said, no, you've got to take the whole kit and turn it around completely, just like a mirror image. It is exactly the same as a right-handed drummer. And I must say that I was thrilled when I came in the door here. I must say that this is only the second occasion in my life that I have walked in a room and there was a drum set up for a left-handed drummer. And it just so happens that there was a young man playing before me and he was left-handed, and I see that someone here is teaching cats the right stuff because the drums were set up absolutely right, and I'm delighted about that. But after telling me to turn the whole thing around, he then showed me a little thing that probably, I don't know if the rock-oriented cats are acquainted with it, but many of you, the jazz-oriented players, might be acquainted with a little figure called mop mop. Do you people know mop mop? Okay, let me show you what mop mop is. Aha. Oh. Okay. Mop mop. Mop mop is a figure that Max, he sat down and he said, have you ever heard this before? Have any of you ever heard that before? Yes, everybody's heard that before. Well, that was the first thing Max showed me, and the reason he was showing me that was to understand the relationship between the tonalities. 5 sounds. You dig? And he said, what you have to do, or not what you have to do, but something that will be very important in gaining a melodic sense, is soloing. And I'm talking about soloing now because we all basically know how to keep time. And I'll get into a little bit of that. But the melodic sense. So he said, you can do it, right? And at the time, in those days, we didn't play 2 stand tom-toms. It was basically a 4-piece set. But when you have this, you can also play. You dig? And he said, man, you should do that all day and all night. So I went to work learning how to just play intervals. Nowadays, you know, cats play all of that. I mean, it's like common vocabulary, and rock cats are playing all of that stuff. But all that stuff comes from Max Roach, and originally. You dig? And he said to practice it in context. Try to take that melodic figure and put it in context. So he said, you know, like play some time with it, something like. So that there's a practical application to all of the things that you learn. Because otherwise you can find yourself practicing things, and then when you get in a playing situation, I mean, have you ever had that happen where you practice something, you practice it, but you haven't practiced it in any real context, so when you get in a playing situation, you find that you really can't kick it in because you haven't learned how to play it in context. So he always said, all of those figures, practice them in context, practice them keeping time, and just learn to play little melodies. That's a primary melody. But you can make up any kind of melody, you know? and just do it all over the drum set. He said, do it all over the drum set. And I can tell you quite frankly that I've been practicing those kinds of things. That was now, let's see, I'm 43, and that was when I was 15, 16. So, you know, it's been like 20 something years, 25, 26 years, and I've been working on that stuff. And I've learned to play, you know, ultimately what you want to do is you want to learn to make up your own little melodies. Let me see. Do I have one that I can play for you now? And then it's a question of telling the story. Drum solos have to tell a story the same way everyone else has to tell a story. And you know that when you hear a cat solo, often, particularly with our instrument, the drums, cats win acclaim through attrition, I call it. In other words, they play use so many chops and get so loud that what happens is people are somewhat overwhelmed and they figure you must have played something. They really don't know what you played, so then they applaud and they say, yeah, yeah, yeah. And all of us drummers actually know how to elicit applause through attrition by just getting louder and louder and taking some figure and playing it over and 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 over again. You know, it's kind of like holding a note on the organ, you know. When organists don't know what to do, but they want to get that raw, they just hold that note on the organ, and as soon as they hold it for about a sixth measure or something, everybody starts saying, oh, yeah, 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 that's just fabulous, fabulous, fantastic. And he didn't play nothing. He just held that note, you dig? So it's the same kind of thing. Max always discouraged that kind of thinking. I kind of discourage that thinking. Sometimes it works for you, sometimes it doesn't, but I believe in the school of trying to develop an idea, and if you have listeners that are really listening to you, they'll get it, and you'll get your applause. But from an intellectual standpoint with the instrument, I think it's important to learn how to tell a story. You begin a story, it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an ending, it has a climax. Occasionally it might be a hero. In a drum solo, that hero may take the form of a tremendous bomb that you recovered your ass on, you know. So the story may have a hero. The story may have a villain, like the stick that went flying out of your hand, you know. But the key is to kind of try to tell a story and develop your idea. So I'm going to try to do that here for a minute and see if I can get something going here. Let me give it a shot. Storytelling, storytelling. Now, another thing that Max taught me about, that told me about, that he talked about often was the bilateral sort of nature of playing. And that was that things that you learn to do, like from the left to the right, say. Always learn to do it from the right to the left. And he said that's because otherwise, if you don't do that, you sort of end up like, you know, tennis players and basketball players who make a lot of money, but they're lopsided. They do this with one hand. And the spontaneous nature of this instrument, and particularly in the jazz context, you really got to be able to go either way all the time. So he said you should spend time learning to do things like your paradiddles, balance them out. Get them so you can almost play them and you don't even know which one is playing, the left or the right. Learn to drop your accents in there, but learn to play things even. Everything. All, everything. Everything. Learn to do everything. Sometimes it's not easy. I mean, like I said, I'm still working constantly on things to get things in balance because I've spent a lot of time playing a lot of R&B stuff, so I have a lot of chops that are not necessarily acclimated properly yet for jazz. But anyway, he talked a lot about those things, a lot about the melodic nature of the drums, and then there was Dad. When Dad did kick in, it's interesting. When Dad finally kicked in when I was 20 years old, right? And the way Dad kicks into my musical career is he comes in the house one day, he says, "Are you ready to play?" And I said, yeah, I guess so. And 2 days later, I was on national television with him, right? No rehearsal, trial by fire. Right? And I was in the band, and I was doing it. But there was an interesting thing that occurred that really let me know what the Giants were all about. We're playing in the Village Vanguard in New York City, right? The joint is packed. We love it. We love it. You know, I'm grooving. I'm 21 years old, man. I'm here with Thelonious Monk. I'm holding my own, you know, it ain't just a fluke. I can swing a little bit, right? The crowd's going crazy. We get off the bandstand, we go in the back of the place, and we're mobbed, because, you know, when you play with a cat like a Monk or Diz or Miles, man, I mean, people mob these guys, right? So I'm in the back, and I'm grooving on the mob, and there's a line outside. I mean, everything's going my way. Now, during the course of the set, right, I had done something, man, and quite frankly, I dropped the time. I blew it. I recovered masterfully, but I blew it, right? So now, but I'm grooving in the back. I'm grandstanding now because everybody's saying, "Oh yeah, hip, 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 hip," right? And through this crowd and all this hysteria, Thelonious slid over to me, right? He leaned right down, and he uses the F word, to be quite frank, and he says, stop up the time, right? Stop doing that to it, right? And I realized then and there, I went back to something that he did tell me in a brief conversation, maybe 3 or 4 years earlier, and he had told me that the main job of the drummer is to keep the time. That's our main role. And everything after that, it doesn't matter whether you're playing country, western, the Borscht Belt, bebop, funk, P-funk, or re-funk. It doesn't matter. So your first job is to hold that time down, and everything after that is gravy, you know? And when you see the wonderful cats that can play, you know, the cats like Dennis Chambers and Billy Cobham, and them cats that can play all that stuff, those guys just got a lot of gravy. But if they weren't holding that time down, you wouldn't be hearing them, and nobody would tolerate all the gravy that you get. You dig? You know, it's like, I mean, you don't want nobody covering up no stink meat with no gravy, right? So it's, you know, so Pop was talking about like the gravy is all that other stuff that you play is gravy, but keeping the time is number one. And Max also showed me a very, very interesting exercise for keeping time and independence. He never gave it a name, and I had the great fortune to do a seminar series with Max through the state of North Carolina about 2 years ago. He reminded me of this exercise. I'm going to show it to you right now, and I hope that I can like execute it, but I will tell you clearly, although I feel very comfortable here because, I mean, we're all, you know, we all know where it's at. We all know that the instrument is kicking all of our butts at the same time, so I'm no different. So if it kicks my butt in front of you, that's okay. Then you just know we're all real. So I'm going to show you this exercise. It's an independence exercise that Max showed me, and well, see, unfortunately, we don't have 2 drum sets. If we had 2 drum sets set up here, then I would say, and whoever is super bad in the house, come on up and just do it. But, you know, if there's someone left-handed who wants to come up and try to do it right off the bat, give it a shot. I don't know. Here we go. I must say, he revels in this too when he does it all the time. But essentially what it is, it's very simple. It's a ride here. It's a shuffle here. Now that's pretty easy, everybody can handle that. Then it's just 4 on the floor, so you're going. And everybody can pretty much handle that. What gets complicated is the Charleston that you have to play on the sock. So I'm gonna give it a shot and see if I can make it all jump off right now. Here we go. Is this picking up the sock here? Yeah, there it is. Ooh. Woo. You see, this is an ass kicker. God. Charleston is Charleston. Ooh. Today is a very bad day for me for this exercise. Get the idea? This will kick your butt all day and night. But ultimately, see, struggling like that ultimately gets you to things like. which is what you want to get to ultimately with jazz, because ultimately what you want to be able to play what you feel, particularly with the swing feel, which is the basis of most straight ahead jazz, just that basic swing time on this ride cymbal. Out of that. It's hard, I'm telling you, it's hard to keep it for more than 1 or 2 measures. Now, what I'd like to do, because my mouth can run forever and ever, is I'd like to open this up for questions, any questions you might have about me, about my dad, about my playing, about my band, about my studying, about anything. Any questions? There you go, guy. Sure. I'm not too superstitious. As you know, it's funny, I was just telling somebody the other day, I'm one of these like dead people. I mean, I do not, I don't hear no voices, I don't see no spirits, I don't get no particular vibes. It's like we were in a haunted house in Eureka Springs, Arkansas a month ago, and people were in pieces. And I said, man, if there's a ghost in here, I just don't get it. So I don't have superstition, but I do believe that I tend to like to practice leading up to a big gig. Redouble my practice effort. When you're out on the road, and I'm out on the road a lot now, you don't get an awful lot of time to practice. So I tend to go into, like, if I have a big gig coming up, I will go into almost like a practice craze where I'll have the set up in the, and I'll have the pad set up, and I'll have the pad by my bed, and I'll have a pad and the pocket pad in my pocket, and it's just everywhere. And at my age, I kind of look like kind of crazy, but like I said, I haven't been doing this long, so I'm trying to make up for lost time with jazz. So I believe practice is I had the great fortune to host a show with Lionel Hampton and Tito Puente about 2 weeks ago, and I was amazed. Lionel Hampton is 87 years old, and before he went on stage, man, you know what Hamp was doing? He was in the wings of the stage with his sticks, practicing his paradiddles, practicing like a dog. And I said, man, you would think at 86, 87 years of age, he would have it, he would feel like, hey, I've got it together, there's nothing to do. But you always have to practice, So no, I'm not superstitious, nothing particular, just practice, practice, practice. In fact, there's a little thing that I discovered that this is perfect, see, because this is like a practice pad. It's actually called a pick and parlor. I don't know if you can get it out here, but it straps onto your leg like this. And this is super hip for drummers, because drummers kind of feel like gunslingers anyway, in a manner of speaking, see? And this is a pad, right, that you can actually, I know how all you young cats are today with the leather and the earrings and the spike and all that. This can fit right with your, this goes right with your dress. It's a fashion statement. You dig? But what it also allows you to do is it actually allows you to practice damn near anywhere on the planet Earth. It just doesn't matter where you are. If you have 2 sticks, this is good, and I recommend it, even though the people who make it don't know I'm recommending it. I recommend it because it has the sort of the same resiliency as a drum head. It's not really hard, but it's not as soft as rubber, which is sometimes deceiving. And I believe, and this is something that Max always also told me right off the bat, man, he said, practice with what you play with. And as often as you can, practice on what you play on. So I'm one that discourages, I tend to discourage pads, except for the calisthenic nature of a pad. So I would recommend a pad like this or a pillow. before I would recommend just practicing on one of the so-called better pads that they have today, because it gives you a false sense of security in terms of where your chops really, really are. I mean, a pad like this or a pillow is somewhat like a boxer who goes and he puts on the 24-ounce gloves for a couple of rounds to warm up, to get his juices flowing. Then he puts on the real thing and he goes in there and he trains. And that's what this kind of thing or a pillow is for. But when you get on on a pad that gives you something that's almost the feeling of a drum, but not the feeling of a drum, you get a false sense of security about where your chops are, man, and paradiddles and flamadiddles are popping off very groovy, and then you run to a gig and you get on the drums and none of it is working. And I know that everybody has run into that. So I encourage you to, if you can find a corner at home to practice on your snare drum, on the snare drum itself, which is like, oh, that's the dread. It's everybody's dread when it practices, and see, because I mean, we do all know that there's a tremendous prejudice against our instrument out there. I mean, the saxophone players, nobody tells them to go play on a mouthpiece. Nobody tells the trumpet player to go play on his mouthpiece. Everybody gets to practice on their instrument, but people assume that drummers, he doesn't need to practice on his drum. All he needs to do is practice on a drum pad. Well, a drum pad is not a drum. I don't hear any drum pads on any records. I don't see any drum pads on any live dates, right? I don't know of any great performances that have been transcribed from the drum pad. So I tend to discourage the pad, particularly the pads that seem like they're almost as good as the drum, because that little difference between what that skin feels like with air underneath it and what a pad gives you is just completely different. Somebody else. My top 10 essential albums for a drummer or for a jazz musician. See, for a jazz musician, my top 10, I mean, that would be very difficult to do right off the top of my head. I can name you a few. I would not be able to do that for drummers because I really don't break drummers down that way. I break drummers down in terms of the context that they're playing in and what they're really doing, and I don't, for me, I don't care how many chops you got and how great everybody sings you are. If you're not sitting in the middle of a swinging ass band and supplying the grease so that the gate can swing, then you ain't nobody for me. So I tend to look at the great jazz records, and if you look at the great jazz records, you tend to find that the drummer was absolutely great. My favorite records, as a matter of fact, also tend not to be records that involve drum. I mean, Miles Davis' So What album, I think is a perennial album that every jazz listener should have. I think that my father's album, Thelonious Monk, at Town Hall, is a very, very important record. But I mean, there's also records, the top 10, that's almost impossible. See, that actually cuts against the whole philosophy behind what we do in jazz, because jazz is based on democracy. Jazz is the music that reflects the society that we're in and what it's supposed to be about. And that's not very democratic for me to pick the top 10, because if I pick the top 10, then what happens to the other thousands that I love? Kind of Blue album is absolutely fabulous. Max Roach's album, what is it called? Not Drums, also Waltzes. Was it Deeds Not Words? Is a fantastic record for me. But I could name records that have been popular. I could say, well, God, man, John Coltrane, My Favorite Things is a fabulous record. But also, for me, one of the top 10 records is the record that Papa Joe Jones made about the history of the drums. I mean, that to me is one of the greatest educational records made of all time. Art Blakey's record, Boo's Delight, Buena's Delight, is a fabulous record. Also, I just got this album by, but you could also go to the Miles Davis Milestones record. And for me, it's clearly Billy Boy with Red Garland and Philly Joe Jones and Paul Chambers is one of the greatest individual performances ever made, and as a drummer is concerned, I would, really defy anybody to tell me a greater brush performance than his brush performance there. So it's just very hard to do, to pin it down, man. When you do that, my mental Rolodex starts going, and I keep coming up with 60 that I love. I can't even hardly break it down to 10. Anyone else? Sure.
You're talking about how you listen to artists like Seinfeld philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Well, the philosophy was, as I continue to say, and it sounds cliche, but I'm one of the guys that says it continuously, it was a democratic philosophy. I mean, listening was important. That, you're a team. A band, a jazz ensemble is a group of individuals that have a collective goal, a collective purpose. They have a number of ingredients that they've all agreed upon are going to be what we're going to create with, and that comes in the form of a particular tune with a particular melody and a particular set of changes. And then the key is to pursue that spontaneous creative process collectively and individually, in a way that the individual becomes as important as the collective. But the collective is also just as important as the individual. And I can tell you, I used to hear these cats talk constantly about, man, when you play this music, you have got to listen. Particularly drummers. Drummers get carried away in what they're playing, particularly when they're accompanying a soloist. And you've got to accompany the soloist to the maximum. And many times that means laying back. When I listen, if you listen to the records by the great drummers, by the really great drummers that sustained bands over a long period of time, like Roy Haynes, like Buddy Rich, like Shelly Manne, like Max Roach, like Art Blakey, you will find that what those guys did was they got the best musicians they could possibly get together, and then they just did what a good drummer is supposed to do, which is swing like hell and keep that time rock steady. And when they did that, the mission was accomplished. You dig? And you don't find their records all piled up with a drum solo every 15 seconds. You don't find their records all with them slamming and bashing every 15, every other measure. You find Art Blakey's records, man, action is just there. You listen to Max Roach's records, it's just there and it's just swinging. And you just say, oh, the whole thing sounds good. Because, we as drummers have more control over the dynamics of a band than anybody. The band cannot be loud if the drummer doesn't make it loud, and the band cannot possibly be soft if the drummer doesn't make it soft. So, the dynamic element to our playing is real critical. Art Blakey was the most dynamic drummer that ever lived. That's why he could play a crush roll till it was like this big, and then make it that big, and then make it this big. So dynamics are really the key, and probably the last thing I want to tell you about here today is something that my father said to me on the subject of tempos, right? He said most drummers play 3 tempos: slow, medium, and fast, right? And we all have our own internal clock that determines what our slow, medium, and fast is. But we all have it set in our minds. And the thing that I learned when I played with him for 5 years, and that Max Roach corroborated, and Ben Riley corroborated, and Frankie Dunlop corroborated, Art Blakey corroborated, was that Thelonious had a particular talent for picking the slow, medium, and fast that was always in between your slow, medium, and fast, right? And so it forced you to play tempos that you were not necessarily comfortable with. And the message was that it is important as a drummer that you learn to play the full spectrum of tempos and don't lock in so much to your slow, medium, and fast, which is something that we tend to do. We tend to want to count the tunes off all the time. And one of the ways you learn to play in the full spectrum of tempos is to let other people count things off, because they have an internal clock that's different from yours. And that is really important. I found that to be really important in terms of keeping steady time. See, because if you learn to play the full spectrum of tempos, then you don't do like water does and rise to your clock every time, you know. If you don't know how to play different versions of slow, medium, and fast, you will find that someone will count off one tempo and then you'll take it to your version of what slow is. And we all know, we've all watched ourselves do that, and it's an ugly wart that all drummers suffer from. But one of the ways to really avoid that is to learn to play the full spectrum of tempos, and don't just play your slow and your medium and your fast, because it will be the same all the time, believe me. When somebody says medium funk to you, I can bet you if somebody were to pull out a metronome on you and clock your tempo, most of the times your medium funk would be around the same place, because that's your internal clock. And that's one of the things that jams us up when it comes to keeping good time, because we all search for our clock, and we've got to learn to search for other people's clocks. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you all like this. I hope I haven't bored anybody to death. Again, I want to thank you for having me here, and I want to, like I say, if you want to hear a band that's kicking, come down to the Catalina Bar and Grill and check out T.S. Monk, 1993 version. Thank you, fellas.